The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to explore and explain key features of texts and how they contribute to meaning.
Hi there, I'm Charlotte, and welcome to this series of lessons called Getting into Poetry. Now, a lot of people perceive poetry to be a dull and difficult section in English, and I find this hard to believe because we all listen to poetry every day in the form of the lyrics of our favorite songs.
Wherever I sit, you sit beside me. When I walk on the streets, you walking by me. In that plane in the sky, I watch you fly away. Or see you drive on the highway.
The earliest forms of poetry stem from songs, and if you examine the songs that you listen to, you'll soon see that you are listening to poetry put to music. In this lesson, we are going to find out what poetry is and how it works. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to understand how poetry developed and recognize different elements of poetry. So what is poetry? Here is a definition that I really like. Poetry is the practice of creating artworks using language. The reason why I like this definition is it captures the fact that poetry is a beautiful and creative form of expression and is definitely not something to be scared of, and certainly not only confined to English literature lessons. We have already commented on the poetry present in popular songs, but poetry is also frequently used in advertising slogans and jingles. Poetry helps us to explore our own emotions and the emotions of others. It also helps us to develop empathy. In other words, it helps us to imagine how other people may feel. Now let's start by looking at how poetry developed through the ages. Thousands of years ago, before the development of writing as a form of communication, the spoken word was the major method of relaying information. Ideas were expressed through songs, stories, body language, and pictures. So our journey down the poetry timeline begins with the music and rhythms that has been a part of human development since the dawn of time.
No stars were there, no sun, neither moon nor earth. Nothing existed but darkness itself, a darkness everywhere. Nothing existed but nothingness, a nothingness neither hot nor cold, dead nor alive. A nothingness far worse than nothing, and frightening in its utter nothingness.
This is an extract from the Zulu legend about the Tree of Life. Now, songs usually dealt with stories of great deeds, crime and battles, and human conflict. Family histories were also handed down from generation to generation in songs. Now, although I will have to limit myself to English poetry in this English lesson, never lose sight of the fact that beautiful poetry has developed and exists in all languages. Now, the next stop on our poetry timeline is religious poetry. It has long been believed that religion contributed greatly to the development of written poetry, and some of the earliest examples of written poetry are found in religious books. The poems and songs found in the Bible, the Quran and the Torah are just some examples. Our next stop on the poetry timeline is the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, poetry was written in Latin and also dealt with predominantly religious topics. Then came the Renaissance. Now, you might not be familiar with this term, but it refers to a time in history when there was a renewed interest in art, literature, beauty, and learning. During the Renaissance, poetry became extremely popular. The most famous form of poetry that developed in this time was the sonnet, and we deal with sonnets in more detail in a later lesson. An intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment dominated the 18th century. This was a time when people began to place great confidence in the power of the human being to control life and to question ideas. The next important event that influenced the development of poetry was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution occurred in the 19th century. People became fascinated with science and technology and also started experimenting with the human psychology. It is important to remember that commenting on people's reaction to social events and the world around them is one of the functions of poetry. During the Industrial Revolution, there was a feeling that people were losing touch with nature, and this was reflected in the works of the poets of the time. The time between 1901 and 1945 is known in poetic terms as the modern era. This was a very significant time in the development of poetry, and the poetry of the modern era displayed some distinctive characteristics. Characteristics of poetry during the modern era are experimentation, a break with the past, a renewed interest in history and psychology, free verse as opposed to rhyming poetry, and writing about previously taboo subjects. As we have mentioned before, poetry is heavily influenced by what is happening in the world at any particular time. This is because poetry is an intensely personal art form, and the poet cannot easily distance him or herself from what is happening. If you think of the times that you have been tempted to write poetry, you will realize that it has been during times that you have felt very emotional about something. The modern era in poetry coincided with the two major world wars. Why do you think these events prompted a different outlook for the poets? Could war cause people to reassess their lives? Time period between 1945 and 1989 is known as the postmodern era in poetry. This period saw poets questioning the political establishment. Big business dominated politics, and poets began to rebel against the corruption that they believed existed in this time. The postmodern era was defined by protest poetry in South Africa. Now, this poem, City Johannesburg, is a powerful example of protest poetry.
City Johannesburg, this way I salute you. My hand pulses to my back trousers pocket or into my inner jacket pocket for my class, my life, Joburg City. My hand, like a starved snake, rears my pockets for my thin, ever lean wallet, while my stomach groans a friendly smile to hunger, Joburg City. My stomach also devours coppers and papers, don't you know?
Protest poetry was written as a backlash against the apartheid regime and supported the rights of all racial groups in South Africa. By now you might be wondering what poetic period we are living in at the moment. It has been called the global era by many academics. They believe that because of the many technologically advanced communication tools, such as the internet and television available, people have easy access to information in all parts of the world. In this way, we are able to connect with influences from around the world, and we are able to explore a mixture of cultures and people from different backgrounds. Your generation thinks in a series of rapidly changing images, which can be both confusing and exciting. So far, we have looked at the development of poetry throughout the ages. We travelled from prehistoric communication through religious poetry, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment movement, the Industrial Revolution, the modern era, postmodern poetry, to the present, the global era. It is important to remember that what is going on in the world always has an impact on poetry. Well, now that you know more about the different eras in poetry, I'm sure that you are quite keen on reading some examples so that you can compare the styles and subject matter. Now, do you know where you can source different poetry? In your classroom, your teacher will probably supply you with a poem, or you will be using a printed anthology. Do you know what an anthology is? An anthology is a collection of poems, not necessarily by the same poet, which have been published in book form. This is the Norton Anthology of Poetry. It includes hundreds of poems ranging from the earliest preserved written verse and the poems of Chaucer in the 1300s to poems of contemporary English poets still writing poetry today. If you have an anthology of poetry which you bought as an English textbook, I urge you to keep it. When you are older, you will enjoy browsing through the poems. One of the most enjoyable ways of experiencing poetry is holding a reading. Invite some friends over to your house or try this in your classroom. Each person needs to bring along a poem that means something to them. It can be an original poem, but it can also be a poem that you have read somewhere. At the reading, each person has a chance to read a poem and to comment on it. In this way, you will be exposed to poetry which you have never heard before and may discover a favorite poet. Sometimes poetry can be challenging because poets express ideas which can cause us to ponder some important aspects of our own lives. Knowing the background to a poem can enhance the enjoyment of poetry. So I would like you to try this. Choose one of the poems that you have studied in class, research the poet and try and find out where he or she lived, when he or she lived, and which era or time period the poem fits into. Well, I hope you are starting to look at poetry with new eyes. In our next lesson, we will look at different types of poetry and why the poets chose to use these forms. Thanks for joining me. Goodbye.